How many people are engineers here? Build things, okay. All right, how about product people? All right, and designers? All right, what about conversational designers? Okay, about the same number, it seems. Well, very cool. Well, I'm a product manager by trade, but I also have dabbled in the dark arts of business development. And so I think there's a lot of similarities between those. And so my talk is mostly going to be focusing on kind of how we think about conversational agents in general, and really how to make the right decisions about what to build. But yeah, at IPsoft, I'm Chief Product Architect. And so Chief Product Architect, basically that means that I work with the R&D team, the sales team, and our professional services org, and I try to disappoint all of them equally as much as possible. And then if you may be asking, what actually does a director of AI do at a design consultancy? And mostly it's fake things as much as possible. But in all seriousness, a lot of the work that came out, that's going to be in this talk when eventually it comes up here. I can do maybe some hand gestures up at the screen, but a lot of this came from kind of the beginning at this company called Philosophy, which really focused a lot on how do you do early stage work, innovative work for very large companies, or how do you breathe life into a new kind of smaller enterprise that hasn't been built yet. And then continuing that, continuing that to what we do at IPsoft is, we really focus in on the idea of IT management and services. Thank you. And then add on top of that really a front end that is the conversational interface. So I'm happy to talk about that afterwards, but let's get to the talk. So first, because this is a finance talk, we want to discuss the idea of the single view of the customer, which I'm sure is something that you've all read about in different kind of finance, tech types of discussions. I'm going to talk about conversational patterns, and then finally, what are really key factors that you need to consider when building a great conversational interface. So the single view of a customer, this is where the idea that you're going to take all of the data that you have within your organizations and you're going to turn it into a single view of that customer. And so usually that means having all of the different data lakes and rivers and tributaries, then turning into bayous and swamps and maybe eventually an ocean. And the reason is because there's lots of benefits, supposed benefits, to being able to join all this information. So there's a few of them up here that are touted online. Now, the real issue, though, when we talk about how customers work with you is what's referred to, what I like to bring up as Conway's Law. And if you're not familiar with Conway's Law, it's really the idea that as you build things, your organizational structure really comes through in what you build. And so it's essentially that you ship your org chart. And there are people that are in the industry, like I have a lot of respect for David Bland, but he basically says it in a less polite way, but you really ship your dysfunction within your organization. The political organizations that you have end up getting exposed to the people that you're trying to serve. And when we look at something like this is actually a survey by SurveyMonkey, Salesforce about conversational agents. But one of the biggest issues is really that your site is hard to navigate. And the reason why is because everybody wants to have their organization at the top of that navigation or in the mega footer or whatever. And people just don't understand how to interface with your organization. And so for me, when we come at from the standpoint of bots and AI, right, it's how do you have a single conversation with the customer rather than trying to understand them in one particular way. And really the key points, previous speaker brought all of these things up, but really the idea of, semantic understanding, how are you taking action on their behalf, how are you aware of the context within your organization's data set, and then how do you learn over time, and how do you do all of this in kind of one central place. So this is an example, we do a lot of things. One Bank is what we refer to as our banking solution for conversational agents. And so rather than, doing the old way of turn-by-turn questions, it's basically a web form slammed into a conversational interface. We try to provide the ability to not only understand the flow of a conversation in a very natural way, but also to then, rather than trying to now use the central view of a customer to just spam the hell out of them, why not start to use these conversations as a jumping off point to helping them based on what they need. And so these are some of the things that I think are really important when we talk about building a great conversation. And so the idea of topic switching, using the language that people use, using analogies as necessary, being able to provide them with enough information and how they can actually interpret what your organization is in some way and how to work with it. And so, some of the key aspects when building these great conversational agents come down to a couple things. And I want to first, let's go really quickly through what I would consider the key conversational patterns when interacting with customers. So the first one is a regular chat, and this is Amelia, which is the way we've decided to personify our conversational agent. And the customer is acting directly, having a conversation directly with Amelia. And it doesn't always have to just be B2C, right? It's not just the customer or other people that are outside your organization, but it could be inside your organization as well. One thing that we deploy a good amount that maybe is not as, people have not heard about as much, but this idea of a whisper agent. So being able to enable customer support agents to do their job more effectively, reducing all of this complexity around your organization, even for your customer support rep. So an example of this is you have maybe 5 different tools as a customer support rep that you need to access and then form a view about that customer. So by using something like a whisper agent, you're able to bring this down to one center point rather than having to check all these things and then pull it together in your head. The next thing is group chat. And so this is something that we built a lot of at Philosophy, and I'll show you an example in a moment. But today we really think about conversations as one-on-one with these conversational agents. But the real future of this is to be able to bring in experts when necessary and allow human experts to actually be part of that conversation rather than just the conversational agent. And in this example, at Philosophy, we did some work for PwC and Google. We were building for field service operations. And so if you're not familiar with field service operations, it's essentially where some field tech goes on site to fix something. So if you had like the AC in this room was broken in some way, you'd have to go on site to go and fix it. And so there's also dispatchers, there's senior field techs, there's warehouse, there's part runners, there's all these different people that are involved in the conversation. And so what we started to do is we built an interface where on the left-hand side you had information about the job they were about to take on, and there were a lot of different predictive capabilities that we were testing there. But then on the right-hand side, we added a group conversation between all the different people. And in our case, Patrick was the bot that would then include people as appropriate, order parts, analyze the actual situation. So this idea of group, I think, is something that it's not used as much, but once you start to think about how many different services a bank or financial institution offers, being able to have a regular banker that the person works with, and then including other things like financial consultants could be very valuable. The next one is escalation. This tends to be something that we don't talk about as much in these types of presentations. But the reality is that there's still a lot of reasons why human beings need to be involved in these conversations. And then finally, when we talk about learning, it's how are you allowing subject matter experts to decide what the bot should do or the conversational agent should do once you've learned about some type of escalation. So that's incredibly important. So how do conversational agents actually fit into all these things? Because we do talk about not only apps and websites today, but also customer support that someone can call into. Now that we add conversational agents, it changes things a little bit. And so I've tried to pull this together into a graph that talks really about the idea of the vertical is the amount of volume, the number of kind of discussions that need to take place between a customer and that organization, and then the complexity of that conversation. And so on the far left side, you see that there's very simple things that everybody tends to build into their web apps that they expect people to be able to do. In between, you end up having humans that are then involved from a customer support standpoint. And then in a very extreme case, there's highly specialized humans. So the idea of escalation up from L0 to LN. But once you start to, and maybe one of the things that's really interesting to me is this idea of right here at the simple habits or the complicated SOP. So this zone right here between apps and websites and human beings, we expect humans to be able to do these complex things within web apps, but they can't, and so they call anyways. But then on the other side of that line, we see that there are going to be people that are doing something that is very rote and while being somewhat complicated or complex, could be automated in some way. And so this is where conversational agents really fit in. And what we start to then see is this idea that you're still, the things that you build habits on, so you're still going to use your your apps, your websites. So in the case of a banking context, say retail banking B2C, I can still get my account balances, I can still do things like bill pay because I build habits with that. I learn how to use that app in some way. But then for things like repeating ACH transfers, even requesting a new card or disputing charges, those are things that I may have to do so rarely that I have to relearn how to do it in your software every time I have to do it because you've updated it in some way. And then finally, there's still that place for this idea of complex things. So financial advising, retirement planning. Those are things that while I can get simple answers or even set up complicated things, I still want another human being to guide me and to be able to balance all the different values that could be at play. So this is an incredibly important thing to think about. Is it's not just the idea that conversational agents are taking over everything, but it's how do they fit in the myriad of options that you're providing to your customers. Next thing is interpretability. And so, this is discussed a lot from the idea of explainability and interpretability from a machine learning standpoint. And so, when we talk about it from a Conway's law standpoint, interpretability within conversational agents is really about how do you make your organization legible to regular people. And now I say regular people, that could be customers, but it could also be your own employees, right? How many intranet sites do you have? How many different sections of your website do you actually have? And maybe just really quickly, I of course like to use this joke all the time in all of my talks about machine learning, and I swear it's going to be the only machine learning joke in this talk, but basically the mom asked, why did you kick your sister? Because my attention was on her. Mom, be more specific. Because of the vector, huh? C embedding 122, 01, 13, 23, 199. All right, so all this is meant to say is that we do a lot of things within our organizations that make sense to us. And then if we explain exactly why they exist or in that context, they make sense to us because we've been building out these complex situations for a very long time. And the same thing with machine learning, right? It's giving the exact answer of why it did something, like what actually caused it to do that type of thing. But the reality is when people need to make hard decisions, they don't want the exact reason why. They want to understand how you can make their decision-making easier. How you can actually help them understand the situation better in some way. And so, systems that need interpretation in some way are really, really, really great for conversational interfaces. And so, in this example, let's say that I was using a bot and I say that I'm locked out of my account. And what it does is it actually tells me exactly what I need to do. Right, but it doesn't help me do it. It doesn't even explain to me how I can avoid it in the future. And so what you really want, though, is you want the conversational agent to not only start to build an understanding of how I interact with that particular organization, but also helping me take care of it immediately. Right, so that taking action aspect of a conversational agent is really, really important. The next thing is context. And so, how do you gain context? This is something that I think the single view of the customer is meant to get at, but doesn't really help. And I think the reason why is because that information is not necessarily turned outward towards the customer or towards the employee, but it's usually turned towards the marketers, right? And we can say that about marketers right now because there's not that many in this room, I guess. And I think there's a priority scale of what you can start to include in conversations that make more meaningful contextual understanding. And so at the very top, we have things like profile information, even profile segmentation can help do a better job of understanding what that person is actually trying to do with your organization. And the same thing with behavioral info. The next thing is to be able to start to predict based on this information what they could need. Being able to pick up from a previous conversation and then even ask them outright. And then I put things like sentiment at the very bottom of this. And the reason why is that I have a pretty negative valence perspective on sentiment. And the reason why is that a lot of the time, we're building out these types of conversational interfaces based on standard operating procedure. And that standard operating procedure doesn't care about emotion. When was the last time that you saw a customer support script that said, if angry, do this completely different thing, right? Or if sad, help them in some other way. Now, there are some organizations that do care about this, right? There are some organizations that have budgets to be able to do that, and they use human judgment to allow for that. But what I would say is that while a lot of the research is starting to show that pure text sentiment analysis is very hard to understand the inner context, and I actually did work with Effectiva for a little while when I was at a VC out of Hong Kong, and they were one of our investments. And so Effectiva does a really interesting job because they use facial analysis. Now, the problem will be that once we get to this point, that facial analysis, tone analysis, and even kind of textual analysis, right, which, here's a quick hint. If you ever want to be escalated automatically, probably just type in all caps. Okay, because that is considered to be a very negative type of valence when it comes to sentiment. So all I would say is that sentiment is interesting and it's important, but I would argue that in a lot of the context when it comes to, say, financial institutions, there's no difference in what you would actually take action on. So in this case, right, how much better is the experience when, in this case, Amelia takes into account the reason why I actually am trying to get some help? And then, judging success of conversational agents, I think, comes down to a few things. And so we use this as a rubric to decide what is actually the right type of skill to build into conversational agents. And we always look at the valuable, usable, and feasible. And so a lot of the time, people start with something like an FAQ or troubleshooting step by step. And while that is feasible, it's very easy to build those types of things out. You can even just use keyword matching systems to get at something like that. It doesn't really help people that much, and it doesn't provide that much value or ROI to your organization. And so for us, if you're not allowing the conversational agent to take action on behalf of that customer, I think that you're not going to really get to the level of kind of high ROI that you need. And when it comes to machines and humans, this is related to some work that we did around that field service operations. And so we built a bunch of prototypes. It was all faking out what machine learning, chatbots, conversational agents, this was a few years ago. And then we took a lot of our observations. In this case, it was all the observations that had to do with the chatbot. And we put them on this graph where vertically it was understanding at the top to not understanding at the bottom, from negative opinion, or the way we understood it in that thing, to positive. And we started to see some clustering. And so basically below the line, where they didn't understand, those were things that we had to go back to the drawing board about, right? So they were things that they just didn't understand why it was working the way it was. In the upper right-hand corner, what we started to see is these are the things that they were really happy about, right? They understood what was going on. They felt very positive about it. And so these were the things that, definitely were validation of Patrick in this case. And then the upper left-hand corner, these were things where the people knew exactly what the bot was doing, but they were not happy with it. And we initially started to consider that as something like job security. After giving this presentation for about 2 years now, and keep on looking at this graph, I actually came to a different conclusion. And so at the bottom, it's still the things that we need to revise or we need to rethink about when it comes to the conversational interface itself. But the upper right-hand corner are really the things that are frankly bullshit parts of their jobs. Right? These are the things they don't want to do. These are the things they want to automate. And the things in the upper left-hand corner, though, were not things that are about job security, but it's about meaning of the job that they have. And so it wasn't so much about automation in that case. It was about the things that they enjoy in their work. And so, the questions I always want to ask when we start to consider what we should actually be building when it comes to conversational agents is, what if they could opt out? What if the customer could just opt out and you were penalized for it in some way? And then, how do we keep the meaningful parts of the job available to people? Right? And maybe in closing, the biggest thing I would say is that it's really, really important for you as complex organizations to make your organization legible to people, and conversational agents are a great way to do that. And finally, I just want to remind everybody here that even though we're talking about automating things, we're still talking about technologies that simply intermediate to humans. And so I don't want you to forget that. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Chris. So we have one question. So in a practical application, how would you kind of design that feedback loop, and like what KPIs or metrics are you focusing on to see like, is my bot doing well, or where can it improve?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the most basic ones tend to be intent recognition percentage, which is really matching of an utterance to like some type of intent with an end action, and then finally skill completion, right? So how often do you get to the end of an actual skill for that person? What we look at a lot, though, in addition to that, are things like number of handles, right? So when did the automation actually do the complete thing versus when did it need to escalate to a human being? And then when did that human being abandon that session in some way? And there's actually another kind of nuance around abandoned escalations by the customer support rep, but it's a very small case. So I think those things are really, really key and really powerful. Now, I think it's something along those lines. Now, what I think we need to get to, though, is we need to start to understand how we maintain these things over time. And that's much more complex, right? It's not only how do we modify or maintain the skills that we have, but how do we know when we need to add a new skill or we need to split skills? And so this is something that I'm actively working on right now to figure out. And I think it is a very hard thing. We've definitely done a lot of great strides from the R&D perspective, but I think there's still more to do. And so it's not, unfortunately, I think it's like another 25-minute talk. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.